A desperate voice shatters the silence of a forgotten world. A blue-skinned child emerges from the undergrowth, pleading for help as her mother lies trapped in a predator's nest. Abel, a battle-hardened survivor who turned his back on humanity, now faces a choice that could unravel 3 years of isolation. Will he risk everything for strangers or let his hardened heart condemn them to death? 3 years of planetary silence ended with a single, fractured plea. Abel's world had narrowed to the scrape of his own boots, the rhythm of his breath, the low hum of wind through alien trees. It was not a chosen silence. A shipwreck stranded him here, far from the battlefields and political firestorms he had left behind. The crash took his crew, his purpose, his connection to anything resembling home. His survival became a series of small, dire calculations. He learned which roots held moisture, which insects carried venom, which fruits would not poison him. His gear, the salvaged relics of a Federation supply crate, constantly betrayed him. Power cells died without warning, filters clogged with spore dust. Comlink receivers spat static into the indifferent air. Every morning he inventoried what still functioned. Every night he repaired what had broken. This world eroded a person. The sheer emptiness gnawed at discipline. A soldier with 15 years of combat experience, trained to withstand interrogation and orbital bombardment, found his resolve tested by the unending solitude. The silence was a weight, the isolation a chill no fire could ever thaw. He forged a fragile peace in that vacuum. No more orders to question. No more watching comrades fall for causes that shifted with the political winds. Here there was only the next sunrise, the next meal, the next storm to outlast. His own breath was his only reliable companion. But peace built on nothing but absence is brittle. It can shatter at the first unexpected sound. That high, desperate cry did not just break the silence. It attacked the very foundations he had built. Every instinct, honed by years of combat and 3 years of pure survival, screamed at him to maintain distance, to fade back into the trees, to preserve the hard-won detachment that kept him alive. His hand tightened on the grip of his knife. His eyes scanned the undergrowth for secondary threats, for movement, for the glint of an ambush. This was a variable he had not calculated for, a risk his systems were not designed to handle. The child's voice carried a different kind of weight. It was not the weight of command or the burden of duty. It was the raw, unasked-for weight of another survival landing squarely on his shoulders. It was a sound that threatened to fracture everything. His carefully constructed walls, his rules of engagement with this world, his entire reason for being here, to be alone, all of it trembled. The universe was testing him. Not with a predator or a storm, but with something far more dangerous, a genuine, undeniable need. The undergrowth rustled. A small form pushed through the thick violet leaves. A child stood there, her skin a startling shade of cerulean, stark against the muted greens and purples of the forest. Her small hands were scraped raw. Her simple tunic was torn and stained with dirt and something darker. She was a Novan, a species Abel had only seen in brief, blurry file images. Her presence here now was an impossibility that made his mind stutter. Her eyes locked onto his. They were wide, dark pools of pure terror. It was a look he knew intimately. He had seen it on the faces of green recruits caught in their first firefight, on civilians trapped in crossfire, on dying soldiers who knew the medevac would not arrive in time. It was the look of someone who had run out of options. That specific shattered panic was a language he had not heard in 3 years, but he had not forgotten how to read it. She took a shuddering breath. The words that came out were broken, heavily accented, but unmistakable. "Please, human, help." The phrase landed like a physical blow. Human. The word itself was a relic from a life he had discarded. It did not belong in this air, on this world. It was a call from a past he had buried. She gestured frantically toward the canopy, her small voice trembling as she tried to explain. Her mother. A sudden attack from above. The thing she called a sky hunter. They were gathering wood. Her mother shoved her clear into the thicket, just as the massive shadow dropped. The creature took her mother, carrying her up into the highest branches. The girl had followed the terrible sounds, finding the colossal tree where the predator had its nest. She believed her mother was still alive up there, trapped. Her desperation had no guile. It was a raw, exposed nerve. There was no calculation in her, no weighing of risk or reward, only a simple, devastating need. She saw him not as a potential threat, but as the only potential solution. Her entire being was focused on that single fragile hope. Abel's training engaged on its own. Threat assessment. This could be a trap. An elaborate lure set by predators that hunted in packs, or worse, by other sentients. The variables were unknown and therefore maximally dangerous. The risk profile was unacceptable. His grip tightened on the haft of his spear. The safe play was to retreat. To vanish back into the trees and let this planet's natural order run its course. But her vulnerability struck a chord deeper than protocol. It bypassed the soldier and went straight to the man. 3 years of silence had not destroyed his ability to recognize truth. This was not a performance. This was a child standing at the edge of an abyss. Her trust felt dangerous. It was a weapon aimed directly at the walls he had built, stone by stone, over 1,000 solitary days. She simply believed he would help. That unwavering, illogical faith was the first real crack in his armor. It was a small fracture, but he felt it spread. The name came from the girl's trembling description. Sky Hunter. It was a title born of pure fear, given before Abel ever laid eyes on the creature. He knew the type. They were the undisputed rulers of the upper canopy, masters of the airspace between the colossal trees that dominated this region. Their domain was a vertical world of shifting winds and dappled shadows, a territory Abel had learned to observe from a safe distance, never to enter. He had studied them. 3 years of survival required knowing every predator's habits. They were built for the ambush, a wingspan that could block out the sun for a terrifying second. Talons like curved blades designed to snatch heavy prey from the ground and carry it skyward. Their instincts were fiercely territorial. To approach a nest was to invite a swift, brutal response. There was no negotiation with them. No warning, only attack. Their nests were not simple collections of twigs. They were fortresses. Woven into the highest, most unstable forks of the colossal trees, they were deliberate constructions of bone-strengthened branches and scavenged materials. Reaching one meant a perilous climb with no cover, exposing oneself completely to a creature that owned the air. The advantage was entirely theirs. Even a fire team of seasoned Federation soldiers would pause before engaging a sky hunter on its own turf. The tactical briefing would be a short, grim assessment of probable casualties. Abel's own experience confirmed this. His strategy for 3 years had been simple avoidance. He mapped their hunting ranges, learned their daily patterns, the times they left the nest to patrol, the preferred routes they flew. He knew the low guttural call they used to signal each other across the vast distances between trees. He knew the weak point was the thin membrane where wing met body, a target that required a perfect, near impossible strike. He had crafted his entire existence around staying out of their way. His peace depended on it. The nest the girl pointed to was a dark smudge against the greenish sky, a tangled knot perched in a seemingly impossible location. It represented the summit of certain danger. The climb alone was a massive risk. A fall from that height was not survivable. The engagement at the top was even worse. A direct confrontation with a creature built for killing, in an environment that favored it completely. Every lesson of his solitary survival shouted a single command: retreat, disengage. The potential reward was a complete unknown. The mother was likely already dead, just another piece of carrion in the nest's grim larder. But the child's story held a small, critical detail. She did not say her mother was taken. She said she was trapped. The distinction was everything. It suggested the attack was interrupted. Perhaps the mother fought back. Perhaps the predator was disturbed during its retrieval. It introduced a variable of time. It meant there was a chance, however slim, that a life was not yet over, but suspended. That small possibility changed the calculation. It turned a certain suicide mission into a desperate rescue. The nest was no longer just a death trap. It was also a potential prison. And a prisoner could theoretically be freed. His mind was a tactical computer. It processed the problem instantly, mapping angles of approach, estimating the predator's reaction time, calculating the structural integrity of the branches. The data was bleak. Climbing that colossal tree was a nightmare scenario. It was a vertical exposure with zero cover. He would be a slow-moving target against a creature that owned the sky. A single misstep on the damp, unfamiliar bark meant a long fall onto unyielding ground. Death was the best outcome. A broken back left as easy prey for the forest scavengers was a far more plausible and grim reality. His body would become just another part of the ecosystem, a warning ignored by the wind. His tools were part of the problem. Every weapon he carried was designed for a solitary life. His spear was weighted for a quick, silent thrust into ground-dwelling prey, not for fighting a winged opponent in a cramped, elevated space. His knife was for skinning and cutting, not for parrying talons the length of his forearm. His pack held medical supplies for one, rations for one, survival gear for one. None of it was meant for a rescue operation. None of it accounted for a dependent. 15 years of frontline experience provided the only logical conclusion. This was an unacceptable risk. The doctrine of acceptable losses was a cold, brutal math every soldier learned. You did not risk a squad for one man. You did not risk a strategic position for a tactical gain. The mission, the greater objective, always came first. His mission for 3 years had been simple, clear, and absolute: survive. That objective demanded he walk away. His isolation reinforced this. 3 years of answering to no one, of being responsible for no one, had carved self-preservation into his bones. It was his primary directive. His only directive. Then he looked at the child. Her small frame trembled. Silent tears cut clean lines through the dirt on her blue cheeks. She was not a tactical variable. She was a person. Her need represented a different kind of mathematics, one his military training had buried but not erased. It was a calculus of compassion, of duty that extended beyond his own skin. Her desperate faith in him forced a recalibration of every equation. The question was no longer what preserves me. It shifted irrevocably to what saves them. This was not a call to glory. There would be no medals for this, no commendations, no debriefing. This was the antithesis of the grand adventures from old stories. It was a dirty, desperate, and likely fatal act for a stranger. It was a choice made in the mud at the base of a terrifying tree, with a crying child as the only witness. The value was not in victory, but in the attempt itself. The worth was measured in the life of a mother and the hope of a daughter. It was a terrible bargain, but for the first time in 3 years, the survival of Abel the man mattered more than the survival of Abel the soldier. The calculation was complete. The answer was wrong by every metric he knew, and yet it was the only one he could live with. Something broke. It was not a loud crack, but a quiet internal shift, like a final grain of sand falling on a weight that could no longer be balanced. He looked at the girl, at her scraped hands and dirt-streaked face, and saw his own reflection, not in her blue skin or alien features, but in her utter helplessness. It was not sympathy. It was a raw recognition. He knew what it was to be alone against something massive and terrifying. He knew the crushing weight of a situation with no good options. Her vulnerability mirrored his own, and for a moment the 3 years of carefully built walls felt transparent. Deep within him, a part of his mind he had sealed away began to stir. Muscles in his hands remembered the precise pressure needed to stop arterial bleeding. His eyes automatically scanned her for signs of shock, for hidden injuries. This was his field medic training, a skill set built for preserving life, not just taking it. It had been dormant for years, deemed irrelevant to his solitary struggle. Now it surfaced with a quiet, insistent pressure, a different kind of instinct demanding to be heard. The soldier who had consciously turned his back on humanity, who had walked away from the endless conflicts and the complicated web of human need, found he could not physically turn away from this. His feet remained planted. His gaze stayed locked on the small, desperate figure before him. The act of walking away, which had become as natural as breathing, now felt impossible. It would require a conscious effort of will he no longer possessed. His peace, that hard-won state of quiet isolation, suddenly felt thin. It felt like another kind of prison. The walls were not meant to keep things out, but to keep something in. Helping these strangers would shatter that peace completely. It would introduce chaos, dependency, and almost certain danger. It would unravel the fragile order of his existence. But the alternative, the act of not helping, would unravel something else, something deeper. It would be a confirmation that the wars had won, that he was no longer capable of anything but survival, that the man had been entirely consumed by the soldier. The choice clarified itself with stark, brutal simplicity. It was not a choice between risk and safety. He was not weighing a dangerous climb against a safe return to his cabin. He was choosing between two different kinds of death. One was physical, a fall, a talon through the chest, a quick or slow end at the top of that tree. The other was a slower, quieter death, the death of something inside him. the final extinguishing of the part that could still recognize a plea for help and feel compelled to answer it. One death would claim his body, the other would claim his soul. He made the decision without a final conscious thought. His body moved before his mind could protest. He gave a single sharp nod to the child. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It was a commitment. The protector he had buried years ago under layers of cynicism and survival instinct finally broke through the surface. He did not feel heroic. He felt resigned. He felt a strange, grim calm. The internal war was over. A new, more dangerous one was about to begin. He adjusted his grip on his spear, his eyes lifting to trace the impossible path upward. The climb awaited. His gear was a map of his 3 years. Every piece showed adaptation. The spear in his grip was a solid, familiar weight. He had crafted it himself from a single straight branch of ironwood, a local tree with density that surprised him. The shaft was worn smooth from his hands, stained dark in some places from use. The tip was a shaped piece of sharpened metal salvaged from the wreck, lashed tight with sinew that had been soaked and dried a dozen times. It was a tool for one thing: solitary hunting. It was built for a quick, silent thrust into the side of a ground dweller. It was not meant for fighting a flying opponent. The knife on his belt was different. It was a relic, a standard-issue Federation combat blade, its polymer grip worn down to fit his palm perfectly. The edge was kept sharp enough to split a hair. This blade had seen more close-quarters fighting than any tool should ever have to endure. It had cut through synth rope, enemy armor, and field dressings. Here it skinned game and notched wood. It was his final backup plan, a last resort kept clean and ready. He opened his pack, his movements efficient. Every item inside served multiple purposes. A roll of membrane cloth could be a water carrier, a ground cover, or a bandage. A length of wire could set a snare, repair gear, or serve as a tourniquet. There were no single-use tools. Survival demanded versatility. He selected a few key items, his fingers knowing their shapes by touch alone. He secured his pack, leaving anything unnecessary behind. This was a climb, not a relocation. He approached the base of the colossal tree. It was a monstrous thing, its trunk wider than 3 men. The bark was a strange, fibrous texture, offering grips that were unfamiliar. This was not like scaling a rock face on Earth or a training wall on a starship. The challenges were alien. The branches grew in strange, unpredictable intervals. The air itself felt different, thicker. He placed a hand against the rough bark, testing its give. He looked up, tracing a potential route into the dizzying heights. It was a vertical journey into a predator's lair. He began to climb. His technique was a hybrid of military rope training and hard-learned planetary knowledge. He moved with a stark economy of motion. Each movement had purpose. No energy was wasted. He tested every handhold before committing his weight. He checked each foothold for stability. His breathing remained even, controlled. He was a machine of focused intent, every sense attuned to the tree, the wind, the space above him. He listened for any sound from the nest. Below, the child watched. She did not speak. She stood perfectly still, her small blue face tilted upward, her dark eyes fixed on his climbing form. Her entire world had narrowed to his progress. Her hope, her mother's life, rested entirely on his competence. Her belief was a silent pressure. She did not understand the specifics of his training, only the result. She saw a man doing an impossible thing. His tools were no longer just objects. The spear was not just wood and metal. It was an extension of his will to reach the top. The knife was not just a blade. It was a promise of a fight he was willing to finish. The climb was a physical act, but it was driven by something more. It was a commitment made solid. He was using every skill from his past, every lesson from his solitude for a new purpose. He was not just surviving anymore. He was ascending to meet a threat, armed with little more than stubbornness and a sharpened piece of wreckage. The odds were impossible. He climbed anyway. The climb became a brutal test of focus. It was not just a physical act. It was a grueling meditation on risk and purpose. Each upward movement required his full attention. A single mistake meant a fall onto the unyielding ground far below. The rough bark offered some handholds, but they were unpredictable. Pieces sometimes came loose in his grip. He felt one foothold crumble under his weight, his boot slipping on the damp wood. For a terrible second he hung by one arm, his muscles screaming, his body swinging out over the long drop. He found a new grip. He kept moving. Each pull of his body, each careful placement of his boot, brought him deeper into the sky hunter's domain. The air felt different up here. The wind currents shifted in strange, unpredictable ways, pushing and pulling at him. He was a target now, a slow-moving shape on a vertical plane. He felt exposed. The girl was a small blue dot far below, a silent witness to his slow, deliberate progress. Her hope was a tangible thing, a weight that pulled him upward as much as gravity pulled him down. His muscles burned, sweat soaked his worn tunic. The familiar ache in his shoulders and back was a constant companion, but his body remembered movements his mind had forgotten, the precise footwork from rock climbing drills, the shoulder roll he'd used to break a fall, the controlled breathing to manage adrenaline. These were old soldier tricks. They merged with the new knowledge he had earned on this planet. He knew which branch type snapped under pressure. He could read the wind's warning signs. His combat instincts and his hard-learned survival skills worked together now. He was not just a climber. He was a predator moving through another predator's territory. He moved with a silent, deadly focus, conserving energy, minimizing sound. The higher he went, the greater the exposure. There was no cover. A sudden shadow from above could mean the end. Every sense stayed at its peak. He listened for the familiar guttural call. He watched for the flicker of a massive shadow passing over the sun. He smelled the air for the sharp, musky scent of the creature. His entire being was a single, taut wire of anticipation. He was waiting for the first sign of the danger he knew was waiting. The nest grew larger above him. It was a dark, tangled mass of woven branches and other less identifiable materials. It was a fortress perched in the sky. It represented the culmination of all the risk. It was the source of the threat, the home of the creature that could end him in seconds. But it was also something else now. It was potential salvation. The blue-skinned woman, if she lived, was in there. The entire terrible, arduous climb led to that single point. The threat and the hope were one and the same. He could turn back. He could still descend and return to his quiet, empty life. He looked down once at the distant ground, at the small figure still watching him. Then he looked up at the nest. He kept climbing. The structure took shape above him. A mass of tangled branches and debris woven together in a fortification of terrifying efficiency. This was no random pile of sticks. It was architecture. It spoke of instinct refined to a brutal purpose. The latticework of wood and vine formed a solid platform, but other materials were woven throughout. The pale gleam of bones, some large, some small, scraps of hide from unknown animals, all of it fused into a single, intimidating fortress that dominated this high fork in the colossal tree. Its sheer size made his breath catch. The child described a lone predator. This nest suggested a pair, a mated couple or worse, a breeding colony. The entrance was a jagged opening on the nest's underside. It showed clear signs of recent heavy traffic. Deep, fresh grooves were scored into the bark of the supporting branch, as if something massive had landed hard and skidded. Smaller twigs and bits of debris were scattered around the opening. Disturbed by a recent exit or entry, the silence from within felt heavy, expectant. He froze his ascent, pressing himself against the rough trunk. The point of assessment. His military mind took over, shutting down the thrum of adrenaline. He mapped the approach vectors. A direct frontal assault on the entrance was suicide. He needed an angle, an unexpected line of attack. He scanned for alternative points of entry, for weak spots in the nest's construction. He traced potential escape routes, grimly noting they were all downward, all difficult. A retreat under attack would be a deadly, controlled fall. Contingency plans formed instantly. If one sky hunter, engage with the spear, aim for the wing joint. If two, use the knife in close quarters. Create enough chaos to grab the woman and retreat. If the nest structure collapsed during the fight, anchor to the main trunk and hope the fall didn't kill them all. Each scenario was bleak. Each one ended in a high probability of injury or death. The soldier in him calculated the odds and found them unacceptable. The man ignored the numbers. He took a slow breath, filtering the air. The scent was unmistakable. The sharp, musky odor of the predator, a smell he knew from marking trees on the ground. Underneath it was the coppery tang of blood and the faint, sweet smell of recent death. The smells of an active lair. Then came the sound. A faint rustle from deep within the nest's dark interior. A dry scrape like something shifting its weight. It was not the sound of feeding. It was the sound of something alive and moving, but it was not definitive. It could be the wounded mother. It could be the predator tending to its meal. It could be a second sky hunter he had not yet seen. This was the line. The final threshold. To advance was to step into that darkness, to commit to a fight on ground he did not own. To retreat was to climb back down, to face the child, and to live with the knowledge that he had come this far only to turn back. He looked at the dark opening. He adjusted his grip on the spear. The decision was no longer a thought. It was an action. He moved forward. The moment his head cleared the nest's entrance, the attack came. There was no warning growl, no posturing, just explosive, terrifying speed. The sky hunter was a blur of matted fur and raw aggression, erupting from the shadows. It was larger up close than any observation from the ground could have prepared him for. A solid mass of coiled muscle and pure instinct, its 6 dark eyes fixing on him with a singular predatory focus. Its wings, partially unfurled in the cramped space, made it seem to fill the entire nest. Talons, each one a curved blade longer than his hand, slashed through the air where his head had been a fraction of a second before. He felt the wind of the pass, smelled the foul scent of its breath. Abel's body reacted without consulting his mind. 15 years of combat reflexes took control. He dropped into a low crouch, the spear coming up automatically. This was not the careful, patient movement of a hunter. This was the brutal, efficient economy of a soldier. His world narrowed to the immediate threat. The child below, his own survival. The woman somewhere in the nest, all of it vanished. There was only the creature and the next half-second of action. He fought with a different purpose now. Not for food, not for territory, but to protect someone. The shift was fundamental. It changed his stance, his timing, his focus. He saw the opening. The creature's long neck, extended from its lunge, presented a narrow target. His muscles remembered the motion from 100 drills, 1,000 forgotten skirmishes. The spear thrust was not a thought. It was pure muscle memory. He drove the sharpened metal tip forward with all his weight behind it, aiming for the vulnerable juncture where the neck met the body. The impact was solid, jarring. The creature's scream was not a sound of pain as he knew it, but a piercing, vibrating shriek that seemed to shake the very bones of the nest. It was a sound of pure, outraged fury. The fight was not over. It was, in fact, more dangerous now. A wounded predator is an unpredictable one. The spear was lodged deep, but the creature was far from defeated. It thrashed, its massive body slamming against the nest walls, threatening to collapse the entire structure. The 6 eyes burned with a new, crazed intensity. Abel let go of the spear. It was a useless weight now. His hand went to his belt, fingers closing on the familiar grip of his combat knife. The creature writhed, trying to dislodge the spear, its movements becoming more violent, more desperate. He saw his chance, a patch of thinner hide under the creature's forelimb, exposed by its thrashing. It was a fleeting target. He moved in, ignoring the slashing talons, the snapping beak. He was inside its reach now. He drove the knife upward, putting his shoulder into the strike, aiming for the heart or whatever passed for one. The blade slid in. The creature's violent movements ceased abruptly. Its body gave one massive final shudder. Then it went still. The fight was over. The sudden silence in the nest was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. The adrenaline crash was immediate, leaving his hands trembling. The immediate threat was gone. He stood over the dead predator, the coppery smell of its blood thick in the air. He had won. Now he had to find out what exactly he had won it for. Beyond the dead predator, the nest revealed its other captive. The space was a chaotic jumble of woven branches, bones, and debris. A figure lay partially buried under a heavy lattice of broken wood. It was the woman, Lyra. Her blue skin was stark against the dark materials of the nest, marred with deep scratches and a dark purplish blood that was already starting to cake. One leg was pinned at an unnatural angle by a heavy forked branch. She was trapped, but her eyes were open. They were clear, focused. They held a quiet intensity that her daughter's description had not captured. She looked at him. There was no fear in her gaze. No immediate gratitude either. Her expression was one of pure assessment. She was taking his measure. Her eyes tracked from his face down to the bloodied knife in his hand, to the dead sky hunter behind him. She was calculating his status, his capability, his intent. She was injured and helpless, but she was not broken. There was a core of solid strength in her that went beyond physical condition. Abel's field medic training surfaced. It bypassed the soldier and went straight to work. His eyes scanned her, performing a rapid triage. The most immediate threat was the pinned leg. The injury was serious. The break looked clean, a mid-femur fracture from the weight of the debris. It was not immediately fatal, but it was debilitating. The purplish blood from the wounds on her arms and torso was clotting. They were superficial. The real danger was the leg and the risk of shock setting in. She had been here for hours, trapped and exposed. Her body was starting to pay the price. Her position told a story of the attack. She had been shoved or fallen into a corner of the nest, and a section of the structure had collapsed on her during the struggle. The sky hunter, perhaps distracted or intending to return to its meal later, had left her there. The debris that held her was precarious. It was an unstable web. Pulling the wrong piece could shift the entire mass, bringing more weight down on her, or causing a larger section of the nest to give way. The work had to be done with careful precision. There was no room for brute force. 2 survivors now depended on his skills. The calculation was immediate and clinical. Stabilize the patient. Extract the patient. The child waiting below was the third unspoken factor in every decision. He had to get this woman down the tree. That journey began with freeing her without causing more harm. He moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He kept his hands visible. He spoke in a low, calm tone, though he knew she likely couldn't understand the words. The tone was what mattered. It was the tone he'd use with a wounded soldier on a noisy battlefield. It said, "Help is here." It said, "Be still." He assessed the pile of debris, looking for the key piece, the linchpin that, when moved, would relieve the pressure without triggering a collapse. Every move now was a calculated risk. The fight was over. The real work was just beginning. His hands remembered what his mind had forgotten. The precise motion of checking a pulse, the specific pressure to apply to a wound, the careful feel for broken bone beneath the skin. 3 years of disuse fell away. His fingers moved with an old, familiar certainty. He assessed Lyra's injuries with a cold, professional detachment. This was not the time for emotion. It was a time for procedure. The leg was the priority. A clear break of the femur. It required stabilization immediately. Any attempt to move her without securing it would turn a serious injury into a catastrophic one. The bone could shift, severing an artery. The pain alone could send her into shock. He opened his pack. His hands knew every item by touch. He bypassed the hunting gear, the rations, the tools for one. He found what he needed: a roll of tough membrane cloth normally used for water collection. 2 flat, strong pieces of ironwood he used to level his cooking pot. A length of sturdy sinew cord. These were not medical supplies. In his hands they became exactly that. The improvisation was born of stark necessity. He had no splints, no bandages, no painkillers. He had only what the planet had given him and what his past had taught him. He worked quickly. His movements were efficient, minimal. He positioned the flat wood pieces on either side of her leg. He wrapped the membrane cloth tight around them, creating a rigid casing. He used the sinew to tie it all securely, checking the knots would hold. The splint was crude. It was also effective. It would keep the bone fragments aligned. It would protect the leg during the movement that was to come. It was a field solution, ugly but functional. Lyra watched him work. She did not flinch away from his touch. Her gaze was focused on his hands, on his face. There was no shared language between them. No words to offer comfort or explanation, yet a quiet understanding passed between them. His actions were his language. The careful pressure of his fingers. The deliberate, purposeful way he secured the splint. These things spoke more clearly than any promise. They said he knew what he was doing. They said he intended to help. The medic he had been before the soldier, the man who had trained to preserve life, re-emerged fully in those minutes. The hardened survivor, the lone fighter, receded. This was a different kind of duty. It transcended the simple math of survival. This was about mitigating harm. It was about using skill to counteract violence. For a brief time, kneeling in the blood-scented air of the predator's nest, he was not a soldier or a hermit. He was a healer. The act of fixing something, of preventing further damage, felt foreign and deeply familiar all at once. It was a part of himself he had locked away, thinking it had no place in his new world. He had been wrong. This purpose felt more solid, more real, than any of the empty days spent merely enduring. He finished tying the last knot. The immediate task was done. The far more difficult one lay ahead. The splint was set. The immediate medical need was met. But the real problem remained. Lyra could not walk. The broken leg made that impossible. She could not stand, could not bear weight, could not take a single step. The injury pinned her to this spot as effectively as the debris had. The descent down the colossal tree was a difficult, dangerous climb for one person. It required strength, balance, and 2 free hands. Doing it while carrying an injured adult was a different calculation entirely. It was a slow, treacherous process with a high chance of a fatal misstep. A slip, a lost grip, a branch giving way under the doubled weight. Any mistake would send them both to their deaths on the forest floor far below. Abel's mind worked through the options. He could leave her here. He could descend, collect the child, and try to bring them both supplies. But staying in the nest was its own form of suicide. The scent of the dead sky hunter and Lyra's blood would act as a beacon. Other predators would investigate. More sky hunters might come, drawn by the scent of a vacated territory or a fresh kill. The nest was not a shelter. It was a death trap with a timer. Waiting was not a viable strategy. His cabin was the only real option. It was a day's journey to the northeast. A small, defensible structure he had built with his own hands. It had a secure door, stored supplies, and clean water. It was safety. But getting there meant a long, exposed overland trek after the dangerous descent. It meant he would be responsible for 2 people through hostile territory. Carrying her meant accepting a profound vulnerability. His speed would be reduced to a crawl. His ability to fight or flee would be severely limited. He would be a slow-moving target, burdened with a precious, fragile cargo. He looked at Lyra. He thought of the child waiting below, her hope entirely dependent on his success. He had climbed the tree for a rescue. To stop now, to leave the mother behind after all this, would render the entire risk meaningless. It would make the child an orphan by his own inaction. The math was brutal but clear. The greater risk was in staying. The only path forward, however dangerous, was movement. The offer came out of his mouth before he had fully consented to it. It was not a conscious decision. It was an instinct, surfacing from a place he had kept locked down for years. His voice was rough, unused to speaking. He made a gesture toward the northeast, then pointed to himself and his shelter. The words were simple, meant to bridge the gap of language. My cabin. It is small, but it is defensible. It was a statement of fact. It was also a lifeline. It was an offer of sanctuary, of shared resources, of a chance. This choice was different from climbing the tree. That had been a reaction to a plea. This was a commitment to a future. It was a decision to share the one thing he had protected above all else. His solitude. His private space, his last refuge from the complications of other people, was now on the table. It was the first real crack in his soldier's armor. Not a crack made by force, but by a quiet, reluctant offering. He was choosing connection over safety, vulnerability over control. He met Lyra's assessing gaze and gave a single, slow nod. The decision was made. He would carry her. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Lyra broke it. Her voice was strained with pain, but held a deliberate, formal tone. I am Lyra. She gestured toward the ground far below. My daughter, Ara. The introduction was stark. It was a statement of identity, a claiming of space between them. It was not the plea of a victim. It was the acknowledgement of one sentient being to another. She tried to explain more, her words halting. She used her hands to sketch shapes in the air. A settlement. A group of figures. Then conflict, unrest. The gestures became sharper, more desperate. They had to leave. They had to run. Her explanation was a patchwork of broken phrases and vivid pantomime. She spoke of being pursued, not by animals, but by others. Then she used a term that made Abel's instincts flare. Living merchandise. The words were flat, heavy. They hung in the air between them. They hinted at a threat far more calculating and cruel than any sky hunter. Abel understood more than the specific words. His 3 years alone had not erased his ability to read people. He saw the tension in her shoulders despite the pain. He heard the careful control in her voice. This was not just a story of misfortune. It was a confession of flight. She was not merely fleeing the random violence of the wild. She was running from a systematic, intelligent threat. The sky hunter attack had been a brutal interruption of their escape, a moment of horrific bad luck. It was one danger in a chain of many. Her predicament was not an end point. It was a point on a longer, more dangerous journey. Her trust in him, a stranger, a human, was a complex thing. It was not blind faith. It was a desperate calculation. He represented a variable she had not planned for, an unknown factor that had, against all odds, intervened. She was assessing his usefulness, his reliability, his potential as an ally or a shield against whatever followed her. It was a grim, practical form of trust forged in desperation. She had run out of better options. He was the only option left. They began the slow, careful work of building communication. Without a shared language, they relied on gesture and context. A pointed finger, a nod, a mimed action. Abel pointed to her leg, then made a carrying motion. She nodded, understanding. He pointed northeast, then to himself, indicating shelter. She watched his face, reading his intent. He asked a question with a look, a raised eyebrow toward the forest below. A question about the ones who pursued her. Her expression darkened. She nodded once, a sharp, fearful gesture. The cultural barriers were vast. Their experiences were worlds apart. Yet a basic, fundamental understanding was forming. It was built on a shared immediate need, survival. They did not need to speak the same words to understand the danger they were both in. The threat of the Sky Hunter was over. The larger, more ambiguous threat she hinted at was still out there, somewhere in the trees, and it was still coming. Getting Lyra onto his back was a problem of physics and pain. He had to support her weight without putting pressure on the broken leg. He used a length of strong vine to fashion a crude harness, securing her to his back. The position was awkward. Her weight pulled him off balance. Every shift sent a new strain through his shoulders and back. He gripped the trunk, testing his center of gravity. The descent began. Each movement was a separate calculation. He moved one hand, found a solid grip, then tested a foothold. Only then would he transfer his weight and hers. It was a slow, agonizing process. He could not afford speed. A single misplaced hand, a bit of rotten bark, a moment of lost focus, it would end them both. His muscles burned with the strain. The angle was all wrong. His body was built for climbing, not for climbing with an extra burden. His arms trembled with the effort of controlling their combined weight. Below, the child Ara watched. She was a small, motionless statue of blue against the green and brown of the forest floor. Her anxiety was a palpable force, a silent pressure that reached him even at this height. He could feel her hope, her fear, her complete dependence on his every move. It was a heavier weight than the woman on his back. His combat training surfaced in unexpected ways. Old lessons in balance, learned on unstable terrain under fire, came back to him. He used his legs more than his arms, pushing with his feet to conserve upper body strength. He kept his core tight, his movements fluid and controlled. He was a machine of pure focus, every sense dedicated to the next 6 inches of descent. He did not look down at the distant ground. He looked only at the next handhold, the next branch. Lyra remained perfectly still. She did not gasp or cry out even when a movement jarred her leg. She held her body rigid, making herself as easy to carry as possible. Her trust was absolute, a silent partnership in the perilous climb. She whispered a single phrase in her own language, words he did not understand. It was not a sound of fear, but of grim acceptance. Her breath was warm against his neck. Her stillness was her contribution to their survival. The descent felt infinitely longer than the climb up. Time stretched and warped. Each minute was an eternity of strain and concentration. The world narrowed to the rough texture of the bark under his fingers, the pull of gravity, the sound of his own labored breathing. He felt a section of bark crumble under his boot. For a heart-stopping second, his foot slid into empty air. He hung by his hands, their full weight suspended by his grip. His fingers screamed in protest. He found a new foothold. He kept moving. The ground, when his boots finally touched solid earth, felt like a foreign country. The relief was a physical wave that washed over him, leaving his knees weak. He carefully lowered Lyra onto a soft patch of moss, his own body trembling with exhaustion. He untied the harness, his fingers stiff and sore. He took a full, deep breath of the ground-level air. It was over. The immediate vertical danger was past. Ara rushed to her mother's side, her small hands fluttering over the splint. The reunion was quiet, a murmured exchange in their own tongue. Abel stood back, giving them space. He looked up at the colossal tree, at the dark smudge of the nest high above. They had survived the climb. They had conquered the Sky Hunter's domain. But the feeling of victory was fleeting. It was replaced by a new, colder understanding. The journey to his cabin still lay ahead, a day's travel through unknown territory, with an injured woman and a child. The dangers on the ground were different, but they were no less real. The hardest part was not behind them. It was just beginning. The cabin was more than a destination. It was a promise he had made. It represented solid walls and a secure door. It meant stored water and a place to rest without watching the trees. But reaching it required a full day's march. A day of prolonged exposure to every danger this planet could offer. They were targets now, a slow-moving group with an injured member. The risk profile had changed completely. Abel's entire defensive posture shifted. For 3 years, his strategy had been evasion. See a threat, avoid it. Hear a sound, fade into the shadows. Now he could not evade. He had to protect. His role transformed from lone survivor to guardian. His head was on a constant swivel. His eyes scanned the undergrowth, the canopy, the distant ridges. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the purple ferns required immediate assessment. Was it a predator stalking? A larger herd moving through? Or something else? The threat Lyra hinted at, the pursuers, were a constant, unseen pressure at the edge of his awareness. Lyra's pain was a silent presence in the group. She did not complain. She did not ask him to slow down, but he saw it in the tight set of her jaw, in the way she held her body rigid against the jostling movement of being carried. Her silence was its own kind of strength. It was a shared burden. Her endurance became part of their collective effort to survive. The child, Ara, adapted quickly. She did not wander or complain of being tired. She walked close to Abel's side, her small hand sometimes gripping the edge of his pack for stability. She watched him. She mirrored his alertness, her own dark eyes scanning the forest, her head tilting at unfamiliar sounds. She was learning the language of danger from him. Their little group, 3 strangers from different worlds, began to move as a single unit. Their pace was slow, dictated by Abel's burden. Their path was cautious, dictated by his constant vigilance. They were not a family. They were a temporary alliance forged in immediate need. But they moved with a shared purpose. Abel's senses remained at their peak. The soldier's hyper-awareness, usually reserved for fleeting moments of combat, became his default state. He listened for the absence of sound that meant a predator had stopped moving. He watched for patterns in the foliage that didn't belong. He smelled the air for the musky scent of large carnivores or the acidic tang of the approaching weather front. He was a sensor array, processing 100 inputs a minute. Every decision was a calculation of risk versus progress. He was a guardian now. The title had been forced upon him. It was a role he had never wanted and had actively rejected for years. Yet he found a strange, grim competency in it. His years of combat training, his brutal survival experience all found a new application. They were not for his benefit alone. They were tools for shielding others. The journey was a relentless test. Each step northeast was a step deeper into commitment. He was no longer just leading them to shelter. He was leading them into his world, and in doing so, he was irrevocably changing it. The solitary soldier was gone. In his place walked a protector, his weapon silent, his eyes never still, his charge a quiet blue-skinned woman and a watching child. The shipwreck gave him an out. It freed him from the endless wars, the political maneuvering, the constant weight of orders and losses. His isolation was a circumstance, yes, but it was also a choice. A choice to stop participating, to turn his back on the complicated, bloody mess of humanity. He replaced it with a simpler set of rules. Find food, secure water, survive the night. It was a stark, clean existence. But freedom without purpose is its own kind of prison. The walls are just harder to see. His world had shrunk to the next task, the next sunrise. There was no future in it. Only a long, quiet continuation. The Novans changed that. Their need was a demand. It was a reason that existed outside of his own skin. It forced his skills to find a new application. His combat training, his field medic knowledge, his brutal survival instincts, all of it had been tools for his own preservation. Now they were tools for protection. The shift was fundamental. He was not fighting to destroy. He was fighting to save. The purpose was different. The weight was different. It was heavier, but it felt more solid. The child's trust was the key. It was a currency he had forgotten. In his world, trust was a liability. It got people killed. Her simple, desperate faith in him was worth more than any measure of safety. It was a value his 3 years of solitude could not calculate. It was an offer he found he could not refuse. Her belief rebuilt something in him. It was a foundation where before there had only been empty space. Lyra's strength was a reflection. He saw in her a mirror of his own will to survive. Her quiet assessment in the nest, her endurance through the pain of the journey, it was not weakness. It was a different kind of toughness. It was a strength that existed alongside vulnerability, not instead of it. This was new to him. His own strength had been built on shutting everything out. Hers seemed built on enduring everything. The difference was important. 3 years alone taught him one lesson above all others. Backups fail. Systems break. The things you rely on will eventually betray you. Your power cell will die. Your water filter will clog. Your own resolve will crack under the relentless pressure of silence. The only constant was failure. But people might not. This was the gamble. This was the test. Helping them was the opposite of every lesson this planet had taught him. It was a bet against his own experience. This single act of help redefined everything. His understanding of peace was turned inside out. The peace he had built was the peace of a grave. It was quiet because nothing was alive in it. The chaos of connection, the risk of depending on someone else, the terrifying vulnerability of caring. This was a different kind of peace. It was a living thing. It was messy and dangerous and real. The universe was testing a simple, brutal hypothesis. Can isolation survive genuine connection? Can a man who has walled himself off from everything find a reason to let someone in? The answer was not in a thought or a feeling. The answer was in the action. It was in the climb. It was in the weight of a woman on his back. It was in the silent trust of a child walking beside him. The experiment was underway. The results were not yet in. But the variables had already changed. The solitary survivor was gone. In his place was a man with something to lose. The cabin came into view against the cliff face, a stark structure of stacked stone and weathered wood. It was a testament to 3 years of pure adaptation. Every line of it served a function. The walls were thick enough to blunt the worst winds. The roof was steep to shed heavy rain. The single door was reinforced from within. The single window was narrow, a firing slit as much as a source of light. It was not a home. It was a fortress built for one. It was the physical embodiment of his isolation, his last private space. Offering it now meant the end of that privacy. It meant sharing the one place he had controlled completely. The door which had only ever closed behind him would now open for others. The space inside, measured out for a single cot and a small fire pit, would now hold 3. It had to transform. Its purpose had to shift from a place of hiding to a place of shelter. The fortress had to become, if not a home, then at least a refuge for more than himself. He watched Lyra's eyes as she took it in. Her gaze was analytical. She did not see a crude shack. She saw a defensive position. Her eyes traced the sightlines from the door, assessed the height of the walls, noted the way it was backed against the solid rock of the cliff. Her assessment was that of a soldier, not a refugee. She gave a slow, approving nod. "Sanctuary," she said, her voice low. The word landed with a quiet weight. Her approval, her recognition of the structure's purpose mattered to him. It was an acknowledgement from a peer. The child Ara required no analysis. She saw a new space to explore. The moment Abel pushed the heavy door open, she darted inside. Her small hands touched the stone walls, the rough-hewn table, the stacked firewood. She claimed a corner near the hearth instinctively, as if staking a territory. Her exploration was not wary. It was curious, immediate. She was not a guest. She was making herself a part of the place. Abel stood in the doorway and watched his solitude evaporate. The quiet emptiness of the cabin was suddenly filled with the sound of another's breathing, the rustle of movement, the faint scent of their alien skin. The silence he had cultivated for 1,000 days was gone, replaced by the palpable presence of other lives. He felt the change not as an invasion, but as a transformation. He had expected to feel a sense of loss, a regret for the peace he was giving up. Instead, he felt nothing but a grim sense of rightness. The regret did not come. The walls he had built to keep the world out were now holding others in. The sanctuary was no longer something he hid inside alone. It was something they had earned together through a day of danger and a terrible climb. It was a shared achievement. The safety it offered was no longer just his to hoard. It was a resource to be spent on others. The cabin was the same. The man who stood in its doorway was not. The rescue mission ended at the cabin door. The transformation did not. Abel's role kept shifting. He was no longer just the savior who climbed the tree. He was not merely the protector on the trail. He became something else. His focus turned to Lyra's recovery. It became their shared project. He changed the dressing on her leg. He adjusted the splint. She accepted his help with a quiet pragmatism that mirrored his own. They did not speak much. Their communication was in the work itself. A pointed finger, a shared look, a nod of understanding. The task of healing created its own language. The child Ara watched him. Her initial fear was gone. In its place was a growing, solid trust. She followed him as he gathered more firewood. She imitated his careful movements as he checked the cabin's perimeter. Her dark eyes tracked him, learning the rhythm of this new place, this new person. She began to bring him small things. A curiously shaped stone, a piece of dried fruit from their meager shared supplies. The offerings were small. Their meaning was large. Evening settled around the cabin. The alien sky turned a deep violet. Abel lit a small fire in the pit. The light pushed back the shadows, painting the stone walls in flickering orange. He portioned out the last of his dried meat. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, a moment of rest earned by a day of extreme effort. The simple act of sharing food began to dissolve the barriers between them. It was a fundamental human ritual. It required no words. Tentative communication started. Lyra pointed to his knife, then to her own leg, a question in her eyes. He nodded. Field medic. The words were rough, unused. She seemed to understand. She pointed to her own chest. Scout. The exchange was simple. It was a beginning. He learned she was assessing the land for her people, looking for a new place to settle away from the unrest. She learned he was a soldier who had walked away from his war. The details were spare. The truths were stark. She spoke of her people's customs. She tried to explain their reverence for balance. It was not a concept of peace, but of equilibrium, an understanding that life required a careful counterweight between giving and taking. She spoke of seasonal celebrations tied to the strange twin moons. Her voice was low, rhythmic. Abel listened. He heard the strength in her traditions, the depth of her connection to her world. It was a perspective his life had never allowed. His own story came out in fragments. He spoke of the field medic who became a hardened survivor. He did not offer reasons or excuses. He stated facts. The words felt strange in his mouth. He had not spoken of himself in 3 years. There was no one to tell. Now there was. The sharing was not a confession. It was an acknowledgement. A statement of who he had been and what he had become. Their mutual curiosity was a quiet force. It was not loud or eager. It was a slow, careful examination of the other. It grew into a tentative respect. They were from different worlds, shaped by different struggles, but they recognized a shared core of endurance. The soldier who had chosen isolation found his hands busy building a connection instead. He was not mending a wall. He was building a bridge. The cabin, once a monument to solitude, now held the low murmur of voices and the quiet crackle of a shared fire. The space felt different. The air felt different. He felt the change not as a loss, but as a startling, unexpected gain. A single choice changed everything. Abel's journey from solitary survivor to protector began with one fractured plea. He climbed not for glory, but for a stranger. The universe offered him more than just survival. It offered meaning found in the weight of another's need. The greatest adventures rarely start with a quest for treasure or fame. They start with someone else's desperation. They begin when a hardened heart finds a reason to risk itself. The call to adventure is often just a quiet voice asking for help in the dark.